Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce, Ukraine War News Update. First part thereof for the 28th of December 2024. Sorry it's taken me so long to get here. I actually tried recording this first off and then got my knickers in a twist over a very long thread that I'm going to try and summarise more concisely. I don't know how successful I'm going to be at being concise with that tank thread, but we'll try. Anyway, Ukrainian general staff figures for the Russian losses for the day before. All the usual caveats apply, and you can find them in the description to the video below. We have 1,690 personnel lost. That's a very high number in that category yet again. 7 tanks, a snip below the daily average. 18 troop-carrying AFVs, likewise. 19, sorry. 29 artillery systems, very high. We've got only 14 drones. Again, another low day, but we are hearing, and I'll report this in a second, that a Shahid drone warehouse was hit a couple of days ago. 66 vehicles and fuel tanks, incredibly, not incredibly, somewhat high, actually sits pretty much in the middle of where we've seen them recently. So fairly expected number there, especially considering they are using the Russians' vehicles and fuel tanks, basic vehicles anyway, for assaults or from getting troops to the contact line. So we have, I think, a fairly challenging day for the Russians yet again. Andrew Perpetua's loss list shows a ratio of about 2.5 to 1 Russian to Ukrainian losses. Combat asset losses about 1.5 to 1, but then when you add these ATVs and civilian vehicles as well, it's probably somewhere between 2 and 3 to 1. When we look at the Ukrainian losses, nothing too significant. They got a radar that's fairly sizable compared to a human being, but it's I don't know how much they're worth. So that's fairly significant loss there. That's going to be that detects missiles, and I would have thought drones as well. I wonder, I don't know how much that costs though, but it added there on Andrew's list, probably a significant enough one to add there. We have artillery pieces, including a Bogdana. I was expecting to see more Bogdanas recently because the Ukrainians have ramped up production of those. The last time we heard it was 12 a month. Probably more than that now. So they're kicking them out, and they probably got enough artillery ammunition for them. But we haven't seen too many of them, so that's good news itself. May also coincide with a massive drop in Lancet drones, because that would be the range for Lancet drones to hit these. Although you've seen here Bogdana taken out by an FPV drone, so it might be used with a repeater or something. But generally, you're going to be, that's Lancet territory. And we have seen a huge decrease in Lancet uses because I think they've been intercepted a lot by the Ukrainians. So that might be why we've not seen as many Bogdanas on the list as I was expecting. 3 tanks there, varying types. We'll come on to tank losses later. Some APCs, including a couple of M113s destroyed and maybe a Land Rover. MRAP there as well, and infantry, although I wouldn't have a Land Rover as an APC, I'd have that as an infantry mobility vehicle. Western ones there. So about 50% ratio of damage to destroyed and abandoned. And then some trucks and civilian vehicles as well. Nothing too crazy for the Ukrainians there. When it comes to the Russians, almost all of them are destroyed and abandoned, so really good ratio there for the Ukrainians in taking out the Russian equipment. Air defense unit damaged. That's a Tor M2 taken out by or damaged by a Nemesis drone. That's good. That's an air defense piece. Then we've got about 10 tanks there, most of them track guard and sheds. T80, T72, T62Ms there. That's what we're going to talk about. T62s. Predominantly soon. Infantry fighting vehicle, a dozen of them, 100% of them destroyed or abandoned. All of them BMP2s and 1s, and a single BTR-80 APC destroyed. Some Kamaz trucks, ATVs, a lot of 4-wheelers and a Golf buggy destroyed. Civilian vehicles, motorcycles, cars and whatnot destroyed, and a few damaged at the end. So bad day at the office for the Russians in the number of bits of kit that they have had destroyed. Going on to general Commander-in-Chief General Sursky here. Since the beginning of 2024, the occupiers, so the Russians, have lost 421,000 personnel killed or wounded. It's the highest figure since the beginning of the full-scale war. So that is over half of the entire losses, assuming that Sursky would advocate for this number being correct from the Ukrainian General Staff. Then he's saying they've lost over half of their personnel losses this year, as opposed to the previous kind of two. Incredible there, if true. And that includes some pretty heavy North Korean losses recently. So John Kirby has been speaking at the White House or at the briefing room, and he has a few interesting things to say. So North Koreans have lost over 1,000 in the last week. Quote, it's clear that Russian and North Korean military leaders are treating these troops as expendable. This is interesting because that's exactly what I was talking about yesterday, how the Russians are treating North Koreans just like they would artillery shells. It's like, we've expended this many artillery shells, we need to buy some more in. We've expended this many human beings from North Korea, we need to buy some more in from North Korea. That's literally how I think they see it. And being so expendable. So, reporting from Ukraine did an interesting video saying that these guys are not getting kind of air cover, artillery support, so on and so forth, that might be given to equivalent Russian forces. These guys are just being sent across the farmers' fields in waves of poorly equipped human beings, and they are being taken out. The amount of drone footage is coming out of North Koreans getting taken out, running across fields is pretty incredible. And they don't seem to be well trained in what to do about that. So North Korean troops fighting, says John Kirby, against Ukraine also opt for suicide over surrender in fear of family reprisals. We saw this with the Russians, although in a slightly different way. So earlier on in the war, there were these myths about how the Ukrainians, if they captured you, you would be faced with a fate worse than death, so you'd be tortured and it'd be absolutely horrific. So rather than being tortured to death, you might as well commit suicide, and so that's what you were seeing an awful lot of. And we've heard anecdotal evidence that the Russians believe this as well. A lot of Russian soldiers being recorded saying, well, yeah, we're expecting to be heavily tortured and blah, blah, blah. So they would opt for taking their own lives rather than be captured. Or here we've got North Koreans doing the same, but not in terms of personal safety or whatever, but family reprisals, says John Kirby. If they are captured, then back in North Korea their family would be punished. So this is better for the Russians. They would, these myths exist for a reason. It's not just random. It's like, we don't want you to be captured. We'd rather you would be dead than captured, because if you're captured, A, we have to swap you, and B, you can give intel away, and it all becomes a bit of an effort. So I'd rather you just sorry guys, but I'd rather you die, is what the Russians would be thinking. Now, talking about losses of personnel, here we have one of these videos of a Russian talking about his local area. Here, this in Kharkiv, and talking, you can see losses and whatnot. He says that Ukrainians have destroyed 70 Russian soldiers in the Kharkiv region where he is, and our drones are, so this is Max 24, saying the Ukrainian drones are finishing off those who remained, according to this Russian soldier. And that's just one small area of one of the Kharkiv sectors of the whole front, and the Russians are taking huge losses. There's no doubt about that. The question is always, what's the ratio and who can win this game of attrition chicken? Now, another anecdote to throw in here, and just to remind you what happens with these naval infantry brigades, the Marines and the VDV, the paratroopers. These are supposed to be your crack troops, and normally they take the creme de la creme off the already existing trained units and say, we're going to take 10 from that unit, 10 from that unit, because these are really good and these are really good, and we're going to then train them up to be even better, to be crack units. But they've been used during the course of the war as bog standard infantry, just plugging the gaps or just doing standard warfare, and as a result they suffer highly. They're being attrited, and they have been attrited. So take the 44th and 155th down in Vuhledar been absolutely battered over time, and they were reconstituted one of those like over 9 times, and that was like a year ago or something, so even more now. So every time they get reconstituted, they lose heavily. They can't take the best from other units because those units are on the front lines and fighting, and so they just have to get recruits coming in, mobilize recruits, and so that dilutes their quality. And then they're not as good, and so then next time they go in, they lose even more, and it becomes this vicious cycle. And so now they aren't crack units, and they are losing heavily, and yeah, that is an issue. So the 810th, they were down in Kherson. They were being used against the Ukrainians in Krinky. Krinky was where the Ukrainians decided to attack across the river. I think the British had advised them of this, is one of the rumours. And it didn't really work, but they ended up using it as a kind of bait, really, for the Russians, and it worked. So they didn't take this vast amount of land, and they couldn't have this bridgehead and do a greater incursion into Kherson Oblast on the left bank of the occupied bank of the Dnipro. Instead, they baited the 810th, for example, to go and attack them, try and dislodge them, and Magyar's birds with all those drones were hammering the crap out of the 810th, and they lost huge amounts of people and vehicles. Anyway, so they got a mauling there. Then they were taken up to Kursk when Kursk was invaded by the Ukrainians, and actually they had a bit of success to begin with. I don't know whether they were what helped dislodge the Ukrainians from the Glushkovo area. Anyway, but since then, the 810th have been absolutely mauled. And then, 2 nights ago, the Ukrainians hit with a HIMARS strike a building in Lugov that had a bunch of commanders. That I think they lost, was it their commander, deputy commander, and 7 other officers in that strike. And it's just been a bad time for them. So PS01 says Z channels are reporting that the 810th Marine Brigade is being pulled out for recovery, but it's got nothing to do with the strikes on their command post. Well. So so this is a translation from a Russian source. Well then, the guys from the 810th Brigade can take a smoke break, think about the eternal, collect their thoughts and prepare for future battles. This is in no way connected to the enemy strikes on the brigade's command post in Lugov. The event is planned. The Marines are handing over their positions and going to Pulkovo for recovery. What's fascinating with this is Pulkovo is basically in the Kursk sector. It is being attacked by, it is just behind the front line now. If we go to Pulkovo, I'll show you where it is on Andrew Perpetua's map, which should render fairly quickly. So these 810th, I think, have been absolutely mauled up in this area of the map, and they're being sent to recover in Pulkovo, which is down then around where are you, Pulkovo? You are here somewhere. The problem is, here it is, Pulkovo, which is there. Like, it is literally on the contact line. They've just taken it. And that's where they're going to be sent to recover. So you're fighting here, and now you're going to recover over here. It just seems like massive insanity. So the guy says here, the Black Sea Marines, together with the Pacific Marines, are the main striking fist in the liberation of the Kursk region's steel brigades, but even they need a rest. The losses will be replenished, combat coordination will be completed, testing will be done, and back to the fields to finish what was not possible. So these guys have been mauled, going for rotation. However, at the end, he said, although Pulkovo, frankly speaking, is a dubious place for a vacation, but that's how it is. No shit, Sherlock. I mean, why you would send them to recover literally next to the front line is quite beyond me. But there you go. That's what the Russians have decided. Anyway, it's an indication that the Russians have really taking heavy losses up in Kursk, and the 810th particularly has been mauled. That has been well documented, and now the Russians are admitting that by saying that they're going to be rotated out due to those losses, one assumes. Now, No Report says yesterday 15 units of armoured vehicles and up to 3 Russian assault platoons attempted to storm positions of the 93rd Mechanised Brigade near Klishivka. I talked about this, said they were repelled, took heavy losses in Klishivka. And here's the footage of it. Ukrainian forces destroyed 6 T-72 tanks. We're going to talk about that because actually it might be T-62s and that could be a typo. 6 BMP-2s and damaged 1 more tank. So potentially destroyed 6 tanks, 6 infantry fighting vehicles and 1 other tank damaged. Positions were held. So the Russians trying that massive attack, getting beaten back. So this is the same footage here. And it's the 93rd Brigade again, who are pretty decent unit. Special Kherson Cat says the 93rd Brigade of Ukraine repels a Russian AFV column attack on the Bakhmut front. The attack is very notable because in addition to the BMPs, and we heard 6, the destruction of 5 T-62s, so not 72s, T-62s, not 6 but 5, were visually confirmed. So anyway, a large number of those tanks. Now, this month, expect T-62s to account for around 30% of all known Russian tank losses. This is what I wanted to talk to you about. We are seeing more and more older tanks being lost. And in fact, if we go to Richard Vereka's thread, this is from December the 20th, 8 days old, but there's some fascinating stuff on here. So Russia has lost at least 3,251 visually confirmed tanks since the beginning of the war. But this month, the old T-62s make up a record high proportion of their losses. Here's a thread about those losses and a new way of looking at some of these losses. Okay, so the first thing to note is that T-62s are taking a bigger and bigger proportion of the tank losses. There was a spike back here, not quite sure what that was about, but then it's been gradually getting worse and worse. You're seeing T-80s get less and less, and the T-72s, which were a vast number of the losses here, generally, apart from just recently, generally getting smaller and smaller as well. So T-80s are getting smaller, but actually were getting larger over time compared to the beginning of the war. T-72s were your standard tank that was being used. There have been some changes, right? T-90s have been lost a little bit more, but actually recently, this last month, a little bit less. Okay, so what's going on? What explains these kind of patterns? So the second thing to note is that the ratio of infantry fighting vehicles to tanks that are lost is getting bigger and bigger, significantly so. In other words, they're losing far more infantry fighting vehicles for each tank lost. Now, there's 2 ways of interpreting that. One, they are just losing loads of IFVs. They're just getting loads out, and the number of IFVs losses have gone up, but the tank losses have stayed the same. So they're just losing more IFVs, or it could be a mix of both of these, right? Or second thesis is that actually they're losing fewer tanks because they don't have as many tanks. And so therefore the number of IFVs they're losing per tank is getting higher and higher. But actually they're losing broadly the same amount of infantry fighting vehicles, it's just fewer tanks. And actually we're starting to see tanks being used as APCs in the track garden sheds, etc., etc. So, what's going on there? It could be, as I said, a mixture of both of these. So then he says, Richard Vereka from Waterspotting says, which is a bit like Oryx, I'll start by looking at the T-62s as they are now at a record high proportion. Most of them are T-62Ms, these orange ones. The variant first made in 1983, but a growing proportion, these grey ones, have been the ORB or OBR actually, OBR 2022, which means these are T-62s that are then probably taken out of storage, fixed up and given a 2022 modification, right? And you're seeing more and more of those, which means that they are cycling through them and they're having to get them out of storage and do them up in order to send them to the front lines. Again, I think it's an indication that you've got a high attrition of tanks in general. Now, when he looks at T-72s, the more modern OBRs, so again, you take T-72 and you do it up to a 2022. So the war had started. We're going to do it up. We've got this new variant. In other words, we're taking them out of storage, taking them to a repair plant, doing them up, and then sending them to the front lines. That's the main T-72s you're now seeing lost. Okay, rather than the huge grey and yellow, which was a 2016 variant in yellow. They seem to have lost most of those now. And T-72, the original kind of T-72 BA, B, and B3. Right, and then these crapola ones down here, T-72 Ural and A, the much rarer type, fairly insignificant. But so it's the more recent done up T-72s. Onto the T-80s, there are a few ways to show this on a graph. Okay, so you've got the T80s here. You've got the 22 variants, again, getting larger and larger. And then then the not 2022 variants, taking up the majority of that throughout the course of the war, given that these T80U, that says T90, it should say T80, which was went from 60% to less than 5% in 10 months, but some still appear. So yeah, you are seeing quite a different behavior there. So now when we look at T90 losses, these are the most recent tanks. It started off at the beginning of the war that you had T90A, which is a more basic variant of the T90, taking 100% of losses. Then you start seeing T90M get used and lost as well. And in fact, the T90M takes up the vast majority now. That's like the best variant of the T90. T90S is the export variant. Now, what they were suggesting here, and this is worth reading. Okay, so with the T90s, I'm using a quarterly bar graph as the numbers are too small to do monthly. Note that the T90A blue went from 100% down to almost nothing. Most have been lost now are T90Ms in the last 18 months with a few T90Ss. My theory is the T90As have almost disappeared, partly because of losses, but mostly because they have been rebuilt into T90Ms. Russia was making 60 T90Ms a year immediately before the war, and then they claim to have increased that to 200 a year. So the Russian claims of manufacturing are dubious, because it appears that they probably haven't ramped up new production all that much at all, given sanctions and issues. But what they have ramped up is taking older variants of tanks and redoing them into new variants. That's what we're seeing in terms of losses of the T80s, the newer variant, the kind of 2022 variant of the T80. Then we see here the 2022 variant of the T72, a much larger proportion. And then here we're seeing a larger proportion of the T62 as well, the recent 2022 variant of the T62. In other words, their production claims are almost certainly refurbishment claims, where they're taking tanks that have already been manufactured, so they're not upping their new manufacturing from scratch. They're taking tanks in and they're giving them a 2022 variant. And that seems to be happening possibly with the T90, although we don't have the 2022 variant like we do with the other types of tanks. The T90M is probably the equivalent here, where they're taking the T90A and then upgrading it to the T90M and then losing those. Okay, so Russia was making about 60 T90Ms a year immediately before the war, and then claimed to increase that to 200 a year. That 200 number might be close to accurate if you count rebuilds as new tanks, but the T90As are mostly gone now, and I suspect production rates will have come back down closer to 60 a year rate. In other words, we might stop seeing so many T90s in the overall loss lists, because so here we go. So the T90s here, start seeing more and more of them as they were doing up T90As to T90Ms, and as they basically go back to only being able to produce 60 a year rather than upgrade older ones. I think you're going to see fewer T90s until basically all the stocks are going to have gone, and then I wonder whether T90s will be more and more of it depends what they're making. So T90s, T80s are still making those. So yeah. Anyway, going back to his list here, he then does a new graph to his thread. He has a new graph here, which looks at where's that gone? Why does it flip around like this? Twitter sometimes goes mental. Right, there you go. This is this new graph. I've grouped the many different types and variants into one of four categories. So all those types of tanks, T62s, 72s, 80s, 90s. I explain why in a bit. Okay, one is a new build, T90M and T90A in blue. So these are brand new tanks built, or the T90As done up. Those are your newest tanks. Two, modern tanks in a stage. So T90As, in storage. T90As, T90Bs, BVM, T80U, UD, T72B, and B variants. So that's fairly modern tanks in storage. but not built from new. Then we have this third, old but complex tanks in storage, T-72A, AV, Ural, and all T-62s. So these are quite difficult tanks to do up in storage. A few of those left because they take a bit more effort. And then 4, old but simple tanks from storage. So these are your T-62s. Sorry, your T-62s, T-54 and 55. I think he's made a typo there because he talked about T-62s twice, unless one of them's T-64s. Anyway, you get the point. Is that old and simple, in storage, fairly new, old and complex, and much newer tanks here. Anyway, so we're now going to we're going to go through, he talks about different groups and looking at storage bases and whatnot. And he says that he created, God, Twitter is going all over the shop at the moment. He created a mini table for himself. The 3 categories are the same as the graph I did: modern, old, complex, and old, simple. So you've got a lot of old complex remaining, very few modern tanks remaining, and about half old simple. So notice the difference. Over 3/4 of the modern tanks are now gone, and bear in mind that 117 of the T-72B on that are from a photo taken in May 2023. So they've probably gone now. In contrast, it looks like the old complex tanks are barely touched. Okay, so he then goes on to do a big discussion on that. You can read that now if you want, but I'm going to skip that. So coming back to this graph, showing the number of Russian infantry fighting vehicles lost per each tank. Does it sound credible that the change might be that Russia now has fewer tanks available to it? Yes, rather than losing more IFVs. Back to this graph from the first tweet. Has production of the T-90Ms dropped from 200 down to 60 a year, while T-80s and T-72B reactivation is now dwindling? T-72A, Ural, and T-64s can't happen, at least not at scale. So it's now only T-62s and T-55s coming out now. So the idea is that they're really getting to a problematic point where they're having to get old, simple tanks out of storage. But he's got something interesting on this as well, because some people have been asking me what's happening with the T-55s and T-54s, these really, really old tanks. He says, for what it's worth, I think most of the T-54s and 55s are being used for tank crew training in Russia. They are larger and their size makes them good training platforms, as you can fit an instructor in a tank with the students, while their weakness on the battlefield does not matter. It would also explain why we see so few losses compared to the number removed from storage. Interesting. And that's his, and then thanks everyone. So the end result here is that the Russians, I think, are running short on tanks. We are seeing that in the tanks that are being lost. It also gives us an indication on what we're seeing lost is what they're able to produce. And we might see T-90s go down as they're cycling through their older T-90As that are upgraded to T-90Ms. Then they lose them, and then it's just going to be what they are producing from scratch. And you'll see more and more older simple tanks as well, as that's what they're getting out of storage. They were using some of those for possibly for training, but you might even see T-55s and 54s lost in the same way that we're seeing more and more T-62s lost. Anyway, I hope that you make sense of that. Go and check out the original. You'll probably do a better job of explaining that to someone down a pub than I just did. Anyway, moving on, we are seeing drones being used by the Ukrainians in slightly new and innovative ways. Here is a drone with 2 shotgun barrels on it, taking out Mavics drones in the sky. Yeah, so there you see a Mavics there, 2 shotgun barrels, having a go at it. And there you can see that as the camera can move on there. I find that interesting. So that's not something we see too often. You normally have a fixed camera position. Here we have a camera that can move to give you a sense. So this is almost, well, this is an interceptor drone. So you would need some ability to be able to move the camera to be able to hunt down what you're looking for. If it's a fixed position, you're always having to maneuver. But yeah, you can see that Mavic was taken out by the shotgun drone. And in fact, there's 3 different recordings of this kind of interaction taking place. So that is a good addition to the evolved drones. Respect to FPV drones, this method allows the same drone to shoot several Mavics and reload. Right, what else do we have to add in this section? The railway station at a settlement in Voskresensk, Moscow region, partisans blew up the carriages of a freight train, and that was a big explosion, and that was used to provide logistics to the Russian army. So, wow, that is right in the depths of Russia, partisan activity still taking place on the railways there. With distance munitions, Ukrainian air defense shot down 16 out of 16 drones, 15 taken out and 1 suppressed by electronic warfare. Now, it's far fewer than we have seen previously. In fact, the last few days have seen a drop in Shahed drone usage. Let's have a look at that in a second. Russia claims to have repelled a drone attack on Voronezh region, taking 10 out of 10 drones from the sky. However, trains are delayed and debris hit the contact network on the railway, so who knows what the reality was. Like I keep saying, there are probably attacks that are successful for the Ukrainians that we just don't hear about. And in fact, we have evidence of that coming up in a second. Just going back to this Voronezh, though, explosive night in Russia's Voronezh region. At least 10 explosions were reported, halting train operations due to railway damage. Debris also landed on Voronezh Tezhkalchuk, part of the SIBUR corporation, which produces thermoplastic elastomers. I don't know what any of those words mean. Nonetheless, there could have been more success in Voronezh than the Russians are letting on. And this appears to be a common theme because, like I keep saying, yeah, it's a quiet night for Ukrainian strikes, but I'm fairly sure something would have happened. And lo and behold, some days later, we often hear that something did happen. Now, 3 Storm Shadow missiles hit a military facility in the Oriol region on Thursday, apparently. 2 soldiers were killed and 7 were wounded, according to Astra. A warehouse of Shahed drones were destroyed. A couple of significant things here. One, we didn't really hear about this so much. Sometimes you hear, oh, there are explosions, and then, oh, okay, this is possibly more serious. Second, super important point. These Storm Shadow missiles are being fired deep into Russia. That's what we want to see. And actually, there's some more detail of this strike. So on December the 26th, there's no reports. Ukrainian Air Force and other forces struck a fortified Russian military site in the Oriol region. The strike destroyed a secure storage, maintenance and repair facility for Shahed kamikaze drones, consisting of multiple reinforced concrete structures. So 1, they had intelligence on this. 2, they hit it with the right thing. So the Broach warhead on the Storm Shadow is a 2-stage munition whereby it explodes once to destroy the outer shell. This is why they're called bunker busters, and then the second one explodes when it's inside that. We are hearing that this protective facility was, I think, underground. I'm sure I've got this somewhere. So Special Kherson Cat says, on December the 26th, Air Force of Ukraine carried out Storm Shadow scalp missile strike on a protective facility of the Russian Air Force armed forces, in Oriol region. As a result of the attack, the warehouse for the storage maintenance of Shahed drones, kamikaze drones, which consisted of a number of concrete protected structures, was destroyed, as a claim. This combat operation significantly reduced the enemy's potential to conduct airstrikes with strike drones on civilian infrastructure in Ukraine, and we've seen the last couple of days a drop in Shahed drone usage. The armed forces of Ukraine have detailed information about the facilities of the Russian armed forces. The work to identify and destroy targets on the territory of the aggressor will continue. This is good news. This is Storm Shadows being used deeper into Russia. That's probably going to be somewhat the extent of their range, depending on what range Storm Shadows they have, because they'll be released safe in Ukrainian territory, and that will inhibit their range somewhat. So location of the targeted facility, it's been geolocated. Satellite imagery of the Russian underground facility used for storage and maintenance of the Shahed kamikaze drones, which is targeted today by Storm Shadow missiles in the Oriol region of Russia. He says targeted today, but actually it appears to be a couple of days ago. Really good news there that Storm Shadows are being used, A, still, and B, in that way, with that effect. So, interesting conclusion here that stopping Russian gas transit, so this is transit gas across Ukraine using pipelines that give that gas to Europe, Slovakia. There's this big political spat between Ukraine and Slovakia at the moment. Robert Fico threatening not to give electricity, sell it back to Ukraine when they have electricity needs, when their infrastructure is failing, because they're not going to give Russian gas to Slovakia. So there's a bit of a fight going on there. Well, stopping Russian gas transit poses a missile strike threat to Ukraine's gas pipeline system. Quote, Ukraine must consider the need to protect its 38,600 kilometer gas network. Without transit, it could become a target like storage facilities and power sources. So you've got a problem here is that this was ring-fenced from being struck. The gas transit, I presume the point here is it's not just for gas going all the way to Slovakia in Europe. It's also transporting gas around Ukraine. And if it's not going to be safeguarded against Russian strikes, because this is Russian gas going to Europe, so Russia needs this gas pipeline. If Ukraine is going to say, well, we're not going to transit Russian gas, then Russia doesn't need that gas pipeline, in which case they might start striking it, which could affect domestic gas transport around Ukraine. I hope that makes sense. That's how I would interpret it. And Bloomberg reporting that it is now a bit of a problem in I think correctly saying that no, we're not going to transit Russian gas because we don't want to give Russia the income to prosecute their war, and then that has a law of unintended consequences, means that their own system might now be more vulnerable. Okay, War Translated into other bits and pieces says the Russians are claiming to have foiled yet another alleged terrorist attack, this time targeting criminals from their Ministry of Defense and even a military blogger. This marks a third or fourth such incident in the past few days. So another claim that FSB have foiled another assassination or sabotage attempt there with IEDs. IED disguised as a portable speaker had a power equivalent of about 1.5 kilograms of TNT in a polymer casing with magnetic mounts and shrapnel elements in the form of metal balls. So the FSB, if this is true, is doing quite a job at the moment in trying to stymie the Ukrainians and stop them from assassinating more and more people. Now, I don't often refer to the Daily Express here, but it's interesting that in the mainstream media, this is a kind of right-wing tabloid paper, but in the UK, it's been quite interesting to watch the Daily Mail and Daily Express, who are normally like absolutely vehemently pro-Brexit, anti-left, anti-globalism, anti-this and that. But if these guys were in America, they'd be more likely repeating, and even in Germany and places like that, they'd more likely be repeating Russian propaganda. But I find it interesting that the Daily Mail and the Express here have actually continued to be vehemently anti-Kremlin and anti-Putin. And I like that. There still seems to be this bipartisan support for Ukraine in the UK, and this recognition that Putin and Russia are the bad guys. I mean, these papers love to have bad guys, and painting Putin as a bad guy here is easy to do because he really is the bad guy. But it is interesting because there are also these tensions there where Putin has underwrote to some degree the Leave campaign and anti-Brexit, and actually as the two of the biggest pro-Brexit. Yeah. So Putin underwrote the Leave campaign to some degree, and there's arguments about how much that happened. And we don't know because the Conservative government at the time refused to release a report on that because it would have undermined the Brexit results to some degree. We don't know how much, again, because the report was never released. Absolute crime, I think that is. But anyway, so the Daily Express and Daily Mail are vehemently pro-Brexit here, but there is a tension because they are now actually, rightfully anti-Russia and anti-Putin. So the Daily Express does an article talking about evil Gherkin here. So Strelkov, who's in prison, and another release from Strelkov. So despite being banged up in a Russian jail, typical Express language here, Gherkin has continued to fiercely attack Putin and his regime. In a post shared on social media, he warned the Russian leader that his time was running out. Quote, Ukraine will continue escalating its strikes, pushing Moscow towards precisely this overextension. Kiev is likely calculating, perhaps not without reason, that given the growing fatigue of the Russian population from this senseless war, our authorities will either softly capitulate or finally strain themselves and soon collapse. It's interesting that Strelkov is now calling this a senseless war. Both outcomes are entirely acceptable to the forces behind Kyiv that are truly directing the process. Gherkin argued that Ukraine was prepared to wage war to the bitter end and was not afraid of Russia's vastly superior arsenal of high-tech weapons, such as the new Oreshnik ballistic missile, which isn't particularly new or massively high-tech. He said Russia's army was incapable of significantly disrupting Ukraine's supply lines and that the Kremlin couldn't care less about the suffering of the Russian population in Ukraine. His remarks come as Ukraine is reported to be fast developing their missile and it will be able to strike Moscow. The Trembita missile currently can travel 400 kilometers an hour at a range of 200 kilometers, and so on and so forth, as we've reported before. But it's interesting that Strelkov, that evil Gherkin, is getting into mainstream media here, and it's not common enough that we see like upbeat anti-Russian narrative in our mainstream media. There's a lot of dooming, there's a lot of glooming, there's a lot of Russian appeasement coming through. So yeah, I find it fascinating that here we have the Daily Express and Daily Mail, and the Sun does this as well. All our tabloids in the UK are actually quite happy to just slam the crap out of Putin on a regular basis, and I like that. I'm there for it. Okay, Julia Davis says, meanwhile in Russia, the head, she's from the Russian Media Monitor, that she translates a lot of the propagandist television, that the state TV and the propagandists that splurge their pro-Russian narrative every night on television. Anyway, meanwhile in Russia, the head of Russia Today, Margarita Simonyan, said that Russia's army should be dramatically expanded and consist of 5 to 10 million men. She asserted that after winning in Ukraine, Russia should be ready to fight future wars that are inevitable. Interesting. And then at the same time, Russian experts on Russian propaganda television expect that Ukraine will launch a new offensive themselves in 6 to 7 days. Quote, Ukraine prepared 3 options, one zone in Bryansk, a second in Zaporizhia, and a third is a new possible breakthrough in the Kursk region. Expansion. I mean, it would be great if they do. My thoughts would be near, Andrew talked about this the other day, near the Kursk region, or near the Kursk sector already, but maybe further to the east, and then they can join the two up. Or I think it really should be north of the border into Russia. Right. US, if they do, but I don't know if they've got the people to do that. US officials told Bloomberg on the 27th of December, and I reported this yesterday, that they believe Ukraine may only have a few months left in its incursion into Kursk Oblast until Ukraine's military is forced to retreat from the region or risk being encircled by Russian forces. So there are worries about Kursk and not having enough people. So then you're hearing from the Russians saying, well, the Ukrainians are getting ready for an attack, possibly into Kursk somewhere else. And then you're hearing Americans say, well, they're going to lose Kursk because they don't have the troops to hold on. The White House has evidence beyond widely circulated wreckage photos that Russia downed a civilian Azeri plane, says John Kirby. So another interesting admission here from John Kirby, significant, and I presume this is intel, interceptions or something, to suggest that, yeah, the Russians really did shoot down this plane. So Mick Ryan, quoting from Max Boot, saying, this is another argument, if any were needed, for even stricter sanctions on the Russian economy and even more support for Ukraine in resisting Russian aggression. I think that this needs to be argued more, that there needs to be stricter sanctions on the Russian economy for reasons, you can give this as justification, this shooting down the airplane. Then we have the Russian Shadow Fleet tanker, the Eagle S, that was involved supposedly in sabotage and has spy equipment on board. Today it was moved to the Svartbak in an anchorage near Kilpilahti port in Porvoo, Finland. I have to deal with so many languages. According to the police statement, the transfer operation began at approximately 10:50 this morning. So that's good news that the Finns are really taking that seriously. And finally, I guess good news, but it's sad this has to happen. Ukraine plans to open over 150 underground schools by autumn 2025. Currently 79 underground education facilities under active construction. Another one opened yesterday, I think, in Zaporizhia. This is great that they can continue schooling by doing this, but isn't it sad that they have to do that? Anyway, thank you for watching. It's a bit of a bumper one today. Take care, and I'll speak to you soon.